Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab, all on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
For Strategic and International Studies online event. Today, we are talking about the evolution of Russian cyber tactics and techniques. My name is Heather Conley. I'm director of the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia program at CSIS. And we're delighted to bring to you the first event in 2021 of our Russia Military Capabilities Working Group. This has been a dedicated area to study and understand Russia's military capabilities and their tactics. And we are certainly very grateful for the support of the Russian Strategic Initiative as part of U.S. European Command in Stuttgart, Germany. Of course, anything that is said and argued conclusions today are certainly do not reflect the Department of Defense or the U.S. government in their opinions, but we're extremely grateful for their support. I can't think of two better people to help us unpack a series of major issues that have happened in the cyber realm over the last several months. And certainly that was the SolarWinds attack on our supply chain, a penetration operation. And with us today, we have Dmitry Alperovich, who is the co-founder and executive chairman of the Silverado Policy Accelerator. It's a bipartisan public policy organization that focuses on national security, foreign policy, and cybersecurity. Dmitry was also the co-founder and former chief technology officer of CrowdStrike, a leading cybersecurity company. He also is a special advisor to the Department of Defense. And I'm also absolutely delighted to introduce my partner in crime at CSIS, Dr. Jim Lewis, who is Senior Vice President and Director of the Strategic Technologies Program at CSIS. Jim is one of the leading thought leaders on cybersecurity, and we're absolutely delighted that he could join us. So with that too long of an introduction, I want to jump right in, and Dmitry, turn to you, please, and help us. As the SolarWinds story was breaking, tell us what it told you about both Russian tactics and perhaps U.S. response to that. You've argued that this attack was targeted and responsible, that Russia was using a scalpel. So those to me sound a little complimentary in that term, but tell us what it told you about the tactics of Russia in the cyber domain. And welcome, thank you for joining us.
No, thank you so much for having me. Really pleased to be with you today. So, you know, I'm not typically in the business of giving compliments to Russia, and I've spent a large chunk of my career working to uncover Russian operations, including ones that break norms, such as the election interference in 2016 and many others. But when I'm looking at the SolarWinds operation, this strikes me exactly the type of cyber operation that we want Russia to constrain itself to. Very targeted, very precise, very little collateral damage, going after traditional national security targets, primarily US government agencies. We shouldn't be happy that they're successful, and we should not certainly pat them on the back and not respond in any way, but we should realize that this is exactly the type of operation that the US intelligence community itself would be very proud of executing against our own adversaries. Why do I say that? Well, first and foremost, it's important to understand how this operation unfolded. This was, as you mentioned, a supply chain hack. This is not a new type of activity. We have seen both Russia and China and others using supply chain vulnerabilities and supply chain attacks to get into hard targets. And that's exactly what they did here. They targeted SolarWinds as well as other companies in the IT and cybersecurity space to get inside their network. In the case of SolarWinds, backdoor their code to introduce a malicious Trojan horse into that update. And once SolarWinds customers started updating their software and downloading this update, they would essentially open up the door to their network to the Russians. But here's where I think we're not appreciating fully the carefulness with which the Russians had conducted this attack. Once they started to get pings from literally tens of thousands, the estimate is about 18,000 victims actually downloaded the update from SolarWinds alone. And once they started getting pings from all those networks, they did something that I think they deserve some credit for, which is in 99% of the cases, they looked at who the network is that's calling back. And some of these were Fortune 500 companies and others that I know for a fact that Russians have targeted in the past, but they said, you know what, we are not interested in this victim, and we're going to send a kill switch to the malware that would permanently shut down our ability to access it, both for us and anyone else. So in a way, they've constrained the total target set that they exploited to two types of organizations: government agencies, and we know there's probably a dozen different government agencies that have been targeted, including Department of Treasury, Department of Justice, and a number of others that you would expect the Russians to want to go after and steal sensitive information from. And then the other types of companies were sort of daisy chain type of supply chain companies, cybersecurity companies like FireEye, IT companies like Microsoft and others, that they could then get into those networks, steal valuable information that could help them target other customers of those companies, primarily government agencies. So all in all, an exceptionally well executed operation, but also very targeted. And the fact that they did not exploit the vast majority of the 18,000 victims is something that we should recognize is a very precise operation. Now, I don't think they did this to do us any favors. I think the primary reason for doing that was to actually remain stealthy. The smaller set of targets you're exploiting, the less likely you are to be identified, and the longer you can run your operation. So I'm sure that was a primary motivator, but nevertheless, we benefited from that. And it stands in stark contrast to the untargeted, reckless, and dangerous operation that the Chinese had executed in the last 2 months with their exchange hacks.
So Dmitry, thank you so much. But that characteristic and the description of that, and turning to you, Jim, does not meet the words of members of Congress that after this story came out, suggested that this was the largest cyber attack of its nature. It demanded some of the strongest response that we've had to a cyber attack against this country. So how do we sort of manage, in some ways, the education of these types of attacks? And so I'd welcome your thought on that, as well as what you saw as the SolarWinds attack unfolded.
Thank you, Heather. And let me start by saying I agree with much of what Dmitry said. So we all know that the Russians are much more skillful than the Chinese, although, and Dmitry can comment later, both the Chinese and the Iranians, unfortunately, are improving rapidly. But on this one, by coincidence, I was coming from a meeting this morning on European time of like-minded nations talking about how do we impose consequences on nations like Russia for actions like SolarWinds? And their sort of consensus view to start was this is a violation of international law. It is a violation of sovereignty. So one of the problems we have in this discussion is we keep trying to impose 20th century or even 19th century conceptions of war and international humanitarian law onto a new kind of conflict. And there's a lot of rough patches, but the debate has shifted. There's now a discussion of how do we impose consequences for things like SolarWinds. And of course, there's issues of attribution, not in this case, I'd say. It doesn't have to be necessarily cyber consequences. The concern is that many of the tactics that we've used in the past against Russia are no longer effective, so that there are no really meaningful sanctions we could impose on Russia. And that's in part quoting Russians who say, oh, another sanction, who cares? Line forms to the left. So we are looking for new ways to respond. There is a normative framework out of the 2015 UN agreement on norms and confidence building measures. But what people have noticed is that while there is a normative framework that's based on international law and concepts of sovereignty, Russia and China pay no attention to it. So how do we change that? And interesting idea I heard from a colleague was, let's stop talking about deterrence. Let's start talking about accountability. So that's a good way to think about it, is there's a sense now that these sorts of things will not stop until we impose consequences. There are people who say, so one of my Asian colleagues said, well, we don't want to do things that would, quote, break the internet. On the other hand, everyone said, we don't want to break the internet, sure, but we also don't want to be passive victims. So that's kind of what SolarWinds has done. It has led people, because there is no question of attribution. Attribution's a problem politically. But in this case, there is no question of attribution. I don't know what we will see in response. The Biden administration is working on some potential responses. Some of them are domestic and will appear in the next week or two in an executive order. Others involve responses to the Russian activity. I don't know what those would look like, whether it would be like what we saw in 2018 against the Internet Research Agency or something else. But, SolarWinds, not unusual, not a big deal. The usual Russian skill, as Dmitry has said, but something that will prompt some kind of response. So we're at a transitional moment in cyber conflict, and SolarWinds, while not a cyber Pearl Harbor, I hate that phrase, it's at least 30 years old at this point. And it's never happened. It's not a cyber Pearl Harbor, but it is focusing the debate on how do we impose consequences.
And I want to hold that thought, because I really want to walk through some of the responses and how we think about that. But Jim, thank you so much for really shaping sort of where we are today. Let me just dig a little deeper, and Dmitry, turn to you, because as I said, I want to build out sort of who within Russia is responsible. And I think there's a lot of confusion between the GRU and their tactics, the SVR and their tactics. Could you give us some insight in sort of who is within the Russian security services managing these cyber attacks, and sort of the inherent nature of that tension, if you will, because you see very different behavior and tactics depending on who is doing the attacking?
I think that's a really critical question, Heather, because we tend in the West to often treat Russia as a monolith, as if all Russians are the same, all Russian intelligence agencies are the same, and they all only take orders from Putin and do exactly what Putin says. Of course, the truth is much more complicated. When it comes to the intelligence agencies, there's three primary intelligence agencies in Russia. The SVR and the FSB are the successors from the KGB days. SVR was actually the first department of the KGB, which was focused on foreign intelligence. The FSB largely inherited other departments that were focused more on domestic issues, and has largely stayed to that remit, although domestic in Russia is often broadly defined to include the near abroad and the Baltics and other things that we would not necessarily think of as domestic. And then you have the GRU, which is actually the oldest intelligence agency in Russia. It was created right after the Russian Revolution in 1918, predates actually the Cheka, which later became the KGB, and is really has always been the most reckless and the most thuggish intelligence agency in Russia. They've been responsible over the course of many decades for assassinations, and particularly in recent years, they've incorporated the Spetsnaz, the Russian special forces from the Russian military, into the GRU. So a lot of the people that are working in that intelligence agency either have that background or share the mindset of the Spetsnaz, of being the tip of the spear and doing very advanced operations, but also very risky operations. When you look at the SVR, I would say it's the most professional agency in Russia, and it has always been that way, even during the Cold War. Even though the KGB, of course, has committed numerous atrocities, most of those atrocities were committed by the other departments of the KGB that later became the FSB, most notably, of course, during the Stalin's era, with millions of people that have been sent to the gulags and killed. But the SVR and its predecessor was always sort of mostly abiding by the rules of espionage, the gentleman's agreement that spy agencies follow. And while there have been certainly excesses, by and large, they've kept to professionalism and focus. And when you look at their cyber operations, they've really followed that mindset. Their operations, for the most part, have been constrained to targeting government agencies. SolarWinds was by far not the first time we have seen them. Previously to that, their most famous operations were in 2014 and 2015, where they targeted the White House, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the State Department, and the successful infiltration of those networks. And also famously in 2015, they also targeted the DNC, Democratic National Committee, but they were not the agency that was ultimately responsible for leaking that information. They came into the DNC to steal information and collect intelligence. Unbeknownst to them, it looks like later on in 2016, the GRU independently hacked the DNC, and we know what transpired afterwards. So I think that needs to be part of our calculus when we look at Russian operations, to understand who is doing them and what their motivations may be. It can certainly change, where SVR can become more reckless in the future and engage in active measures operations, influence operations. We just never seen that. And until we do, I think we have to be a little bit cautious and appreciative that at least one agency in Russia is being responsible. And the last thing we want to do is incentivize the behavior for them to start mirroring their colleagues in the FSB and the GRU. One of the things that I think caused SolarWinds is actually that 2014-2015 intrusions into the White House, the Pentagon, and the State Department. Because at the time, while we were scrambling to respond and kick the Russians out of those networks, and sort of setting our hair on fire for how they've been able to orchestrate this very successful attack, at the end of the day, when you actually look at the results of that operation, it was actually a failure. And I say that because they were detected very quickly. It was a very noisy operation, sort of a traditional cyber hack. They sent out these spear phishing emails to lots and lots of people, hundreds of people within those organizations, wanting one person to click, so that would be enough for them to get into the network and start exploiting it. But of course, in the process of sending out so many spear phishing emails, they triggered all sorts of alarms. So the minute they did that, the US government knew that it was being targeted, and they responded very quickly within weeks to eject the Russians out. So in a way, if their goal was to get into those networks and sit in there for months and years, emulating what they do traditionally in the human intelligence space, where they send out these illegals that we may remember from 2010 case, people that are under non-official cover, under fake identities, that live amongst us, and over time try to get close to people in power to collect intelligence. That is their preferred method of doing human intelligence. If they're trying to replicate that in cyber, the 2014-2015 operations were a massive failure. So I think it's very likely that they went back to the drawing board after those operations and said, well, how do we do what we do so well in the human intelligence space and get into those networks and stay in there for hopefully years and decades and continuously steal valuable information? And they came up with the supply chain idea, where if you can compromise a critical supply chain component like SolarWinds and others, then you can conduct an operation that is very stealthy, very difficult to detect, and you can hope to stay inside of those networks for a very, very long period of time. So I think it's very likely that the 2014-2015 operations actually led us directly to the SolarWinds hack and the new mindset and the new normal, as I call it, because I think going forward, they will take lessons from this, and we are unlikely to see the last of it. It's common for us to think of SolarWinds as a past thing. The Russians did it. We found it. We're now moving on. The reality is that in addition to SolarWinds, there are at least 100 different companies in the private sector that they also targeted. And most of those companies were perfect vectors for further supply chain attacks. So they're basically stockpiling these supply chain vulnerabilities and access methods to use in ongoing attacks for years to come. So we're likely to see that for a long time. Now, shifting gears, FSB and GRU also have very active cyber operations. The GRU has been responsible for most of the reckless cyber operations we have seen since 2014, including the NotPetya attack, the most destructive attack in history, as the US government called it. That was an attack on Ukraine that was unconstrained and hit numerous other countries, including, ironically, companies in Russia, but also Western companies. We, of course, have seen their election interference methods, not just in 2016, but against the French election in 2017 and others. And the FSB has conducted a variety of different campaigns, both espionage campaigns, but also campaigns that have puzzled US policymakers, campaigns that have resulted in them breaking into networks in the US electric grid, not the OT networks, not the operational networks, where you can actually cause blackouts and the like, but nevertheless very worrisome that they would be inside the grid effectively. And what they were doing inside the grid is still kind of a big puzzle to many. So that's kind of the landscape that we have with the Russian intelligence services.
Dmitry, thank you so much. And I'd like to thank our audience. Please keep sending us your great questions. And I'm going to, Jim, turn to you, because as Dmitry noted, I mean, we do see evolution, noisy, although we think that was successful, unsuccessful, the long-term, the patient, the sitting, the collection, that's the new normal. That's what we're seeing. As Dmitry noted, what may be responsible for the SVR may be used irresponsibly in a major disinformation campaign, very much like the 2017 French presidential election, where the government hacked and produced a disinformation campaign using a variety of actual documents that were taken from the campaign, but also mixed with fake documents. So one question that we got from our audience, is it conceivable that by targeting and stealing information from Microsoft and SolarWinds and the supply chain, that Russia is preparing to potentially launch even more dangerous and more massive attacks down the line? I would sort of, in the disinformation, misinformation space, or is this something that, again, could be used more recklessly? I mean, thinking about it in broader terms.
Thank you, Heather, and that's a good question. I hope we have time to talk about the evolution of Russian operational activities, because for me, this really goes back to Serbia. And that's the first time you saw the Russians begin to think. We have this overwhelmingly powerful, but not very bright opponent. How do we get around it? But we can talk about this later. One of the things we've learned in the last few years about cyber is that it's no longer a standalone domain. It's no longer an independent thing that occurs outside of the larger realms of strategy and policy. So to think about this and to think about our response, we have to put it in the context of what is our policy towards Russia? What is our goals here? We can also talk about that later. We didn't inherit, the Biden administration didn't inherit a very useful construct when it comes to Russia. Quite a lot of repair work to do. But in this particular case, take a step back and think about it in the larger terms of how does Russia achieve coercive effect against the United States without increasing the risk of a violent response. And so managing that risk has been one of the hallmarks of Russian activity. And we probably don't agree on this, but I don't worry about attacks on critical infrastructure. I mean, this is not Schweinfurt. We're not going to see B-17s over Detroit. This is a different kind of war. And so the Russians would be very hard pressed to attack critical infrastructure, to do the kind of large scale. We've basically created, and I've said this before, the equivalent of the Maginot Line. We're all huddled in front of, the critical infrastructure to defend it when our opponents, both Russia and China, are going after different targets. So do they do reconnaissance? Sure, everybody does reconnaissance. And so to use a Cold War analogy, every day a satellite flies overhead and it takes a picture and it shows where the targets are. Reconnaissance is not that, it's not regarded as a coercive act, right? And so then the question would be, when would it be in Russia's interest to launch some kind of major old style attack? And I think the answer is never, right? Why would they do that? They're winning now. Why risk having us wake up, right? The Chinese probably feel the same way. So is this a brilliant intelligence operation? Yes. Does it give them immense access to a large number of targets? And Dmitry talked about that. Yes. Is it the precursor to some massive attack? No.
Well, and one question that we got very specifically from our audience, and this speaks to absolutely, let's dive into the operational tactics and the evolution of that. Was there a unique aspect of the SolarWinds hack that we had not seen in past campaigns? Was there something in that, other than obviously hitting the supply chain, going in through a different portal? Obviously, I know there's so much that can't be said, open conversation, but is there a feature that surprised you in that?
No, and in fact, the supply chain element of it is not new. In fact, the Russians, but the GRU, not the SVR, used the software update mechanism in 2017 when they unleashed NotPetya. In that particular case, it compromised tax software MEDOC in Ukraine. And everyone that downloaded the updates for MEDOC was compromised. In that particular case, the payload was actually destructive. They were not interested in espionage, they were interested in taking down networks. So it's not new. The SolarWinds operation was exceptionally done. Virtually every element of it was very carefully crafted for stealth and long-term persistence. So when you look at the sophistication, it was top-notch. But it's the type of things that we have seen from certain elements of Russian operations in the past. So not at all surprising. And I do think it's important, when we ask the question of can they use the stolen data for influence operations, could they have used the attack for destructive purposes? Well, the answer to that, of course, is yes, they could have, but we typically judge people or countries not for what they could do, but for what they actually do, right? So the reality is that they have not done any of that to this point. Should that change, so should our response. But we've never seen SVR conduct these types of influence operations. We've never seen SVR conduct those destructive operations. The GRU typically takes the lead on that. So I do think that's why granular attribution is important. Understanding which agencies behind it can tell us a lot about the motivations.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd love to shift to the response question. Jim, you had already alluded to that in one of your opening questions. So how do you, hold those state actors accountable? How do you do this? And as I said, I think you're absolutely right. The United States is sort of running out of sanctionable options until it really becomes more escalatory in the sanctions posture. We go after things that are very detrimental to Russia's economy, potentially the global economy. So how do we think about this? As Dmitry said, this is the new normal. This isn't going to go away. It's present in our system. How do you respond to it? Love your ideas. And then Dmitry would also welcome your thoughts on that as well.
So it's kind of an open secret that the US and its allies have developed a menu of potential consequences to impose in response to malicious cyber action. We don't have a solution set for doing this yet because you still need political agreement, both on attribution, but not in this case, but in general on attribution, and on proportionality. And one key point is that the response to a malicious cyber action does not need to occur in cyberspace. It doesn't have to be as dramatic as the threat that then General Cartwright uttered a few years ago, that there would be a cruise missile down your smokestack. That's probably not proportional, but we're working through the issues of proportionality and achieving a political consensus with like-minded democracies on the need to respond. One of the points that I think is still in debate is international law and our norms a constraint on a potential response? You do see a lot of that. You see people arguing, that you get into this complex. If people know what the word retortion is, there's a whole set of potential options that are legal. And one of the things that distinguishes, I'd say, the like-minded countries from the Russians and the Chinese is that we will operate in a manner consistent with international law, right? But that does not mean that we will be constrained or should be constrained in taking action. So first step, attribution in a credible way. This is a problem because it involves intelligence agencies who don't like to talk to each other at a specific level. Second issue is deciding on a proportional response. In this case, what is a proportional response to hacking an election? What is the proportional response to this kind of massive attack? And that has yet to be worked out, although there are ideas on the table. And then finally, there's getting political agreement among like-minded nations, both of what actions to take and how to message this. I would note one thing, though, which is that the United States is unique in NATO in that it is truly a great power, right? And it's a large country, and the rules for large countries are different than the rules for small countries. So it would be preferable if we acted in concert with our allies, but that doesn't mean we won't act if we don't have that. So what are the right things to do? A subject of debate. Attribution, no longer a problem. It'd be better to act with allies, but at the end of the day, we might go without them once our lawyers say, okay.
Jim, I feel some feedback coming back after that comment about
not from the lawyers, I hope.
No, Dimitri, before I let you answer that, I want to pull in some fantastic questions we're getting from our audience, and again, thank you so much. Keep them coming. I'm going to keep pulling them into the conversation. Two ones that really caught my eye. First, SolarWinds, then Exchange, two major technology attacks, and I'm going to ask a question on the attacks part, in less than 90 days. Is this unusual? As you said, this is the new normal. Are we just going to see this escalating? And then a lot of questions about, exploitation versus attack. We keep saying the word attack, cyber attack, which of course brings up all that images. We've been attacked. We have to attack back. Is this just an exploitation? As I said, we're using a lot of different language that certainly the press is not using in describing what has occurred. Are we sort of using language that we need to find new words to help understand what's happening?
Well, the answer is yes. So if you go by the strict definition that the U.S. Department of Defense put together, there is the computer network exploitation, which is espionage, which is really what SolarWinds was. And then there's computer network attack, where you're trying to achieve some disruptive or destructive effects, which was not SolarWinds. So yes, going by that very strict definition, we should not be using the word attack. However, in the colloquial terms nowadays, it's become commonplace. And in fact, for the last 30 years, even espionage attacks, most people refer to as attacks, as I just did inadvertently as well. So I think it's too late to change the language. It's sort of the same, I think, inconsequential debate that still revolves in the cybersecurity community about the use of the word hacker. It used to have a very positive connotation. If you're doing a life hack, it's a good thing. You're trying to figure out how to make something out of nothing. Of course, over time, it has gotten a much more negative connotation. I think it's too late to get the public to change their opinions of either of the two words. So I think it's kind of a lost battle.
That is fair enough. Two other quick questions. First to Dimitri, and then Jim, I'd like you to weigh in as well. I will call it restraint and retaliation. So one audience member was a little questioning, Dimitri, of your words, if this was a restrained attack by Russia for SolarWinds, or it doesn't seem restrained in the scale and the scope. And then there was one question on sort of, again, it's always important for us to put ourselves in Russia's shoes in some ways, how they're interpreting this. One questioner asked, to what extent does Russia believe it is retaliating against US activities within its critical infrastructure? So are we already in that sort of tit for tat? They're responding to us, we're responding to them. I would welcome your thoughts on that.
Well, again, as I said, this was a traditional espionage operation. We certainly conduct plenty of espionage operations against Russia, and they expect us to do so, and they feel unconstrained to do the same to us. So I don't think it's a response to anything specifically versus them just wanting to get a deeper understanding of US policy on sanctions, US policy on prosecution of Russian cyber criminals and potentially even intelligence operatives, as they're probably trying to do by breaking into the Department of Justice. Those are the types of things we would expect them to do. And by the way, I'm not arguing that we should not have a response, even though this was traditional espionage. Certainly when we have cases of traditional espionage in the physical world, when we catch a spy, we don't pat them on the back saying, good job, well done. We arrest them, we prosecute them, potentially later on exchange them for our own spies that get caught. We may even, if this is a very consequential spying operation, express our displeasure with demarches, maybe kick out some spies in addition to the ones that have been caught, maybe even close down some consulates and the like. Of course, all of those will likely trigger reciprocal responses as well. So I think all of that should absolutely be on the table. And this was certainly a very consequential espionage operation. It did cause us a lot of operational headaches. Some government agencies had to take down their unclassified email systems for a number of days, which was not ideal, obviously, and only operate on classified networks in the time of COVID when a lot of people are at home or on the road. That presents unique challenges. So this was not painless to us by any means, and we should express our displeasure. My only argument is that we should not overreact. We should stick to the established norms of responding to espionage, whether in the physical world or in cyber. And I think going overboard will actually be counterproductive and send precisely the wrong message to the Russians, that when they do an operation that is constrained, that is careful, that tries to limit collateral damage, they still get hammered. So it will create a perverse incentive for them to not be careful next time around and say, well, screw that. We try to do something good here. Although the reality is, of course, that they didn't do it for our benefit, they did it more for theirs. But next time they will say, you know what, we got hammered anyway, so next time we'll be much more reckless.
I think that's an incredibly important point. Jim, two specific questions to you. We're getting questions, again, I know this is difficult in a sort of open environment to talk about, is it time for really thinking about proportionality and offensive capabilities? And so there was a question of, are we self-deterring ourselves in that sense, that we're not being more deliberate in offensive capabilities? And then a very specific question, if I may read it, was the SVR's usage of US-based servers as operational infrastructure in SolarWinds meant to adapt to the Cybercom's persistent engagement command vision? So again, are we mirroring each other in some ways of how we're looking at this? And if so, will we see more operations meant to adapt to the current command vision of Cybercom?
So in one of the first response actions undertaken by Cyber Command some time ago, it was a joint action with one of our close allies. And at some point, the ally became frustrated and said, well, you guys fight with your lawyers. We're just going to go ahead. We can't wait anymore, right? And so 3 months later, we caught up with them. So we do tend to self-impede. And that was a luxury we could afford when we were unchallenged. But it's, in my view, not a luxury we can afford anymore. And I'd say there's a good, strong debate in the intelligence community and in the defense community over what do we need to do. I'd say the majority still would argue for a conventional, don't want to misinterpret that, a traditional restrained response but a significant minority now believes that it's time to think of a more assertive, more coercive set of actions. So this is a debate that I think will play out over the course of the first Biden administration. On the SVR's tactics, Dimitri would know better than I don't think that they did this. Their planning was shaped by persistent engagement and by defend forward. Their operational intentions might have been shaped because they clearly intended to evade U.S. detection, and that's one of the questions people has. If defend forward means you're on their networks, how did we miss this? And I'd say in part it's because we don't spy as much on the Russians as people think. Maybe we should spy more, right? But I think it wasn't, there's this larger debate of what is the appropriate response, moving in the right direction, I'd say, but we're not there yet. And then there's this question of, it's interesting to see the global reaction to defend forward and persistent engagement because it's widely misunderstood. And so we could do a little better job of communicating it. I have a pretty fair sense that the Russians know what we're doing. And they undoubtedly thought Dmitry would know more how to evade our ability to detect. But I don't think it was as precise as the question might have implied.
Dimitri, I want you to respond to that and add one more really thoughtful question before we close out. Do we still see the contracting of private Russian hackers to support government operations as we did in previous iterations, or have they brought that outside presence inside the house? And do we see that? I'd also welcome, do you see proxies? I'm thinking of sort of Wagner Group and things like that. Are we seeing cyber proxies in any of this engagement, or this is strictly managed by the agencies that this is their remit? Welcome your thoughts on that.
That's a really interesting question. So we've known for about 20 years now that the Russians have done both things. They've done exceptional job at recruiting talented people to go into these agencies and wear the uniforms and conduct cyber operations on behalf of their government. At the same time, when they uncover cyber criminals, they often go to them, they arrest them, and they give them a choice. You can go spend 5 years in a penal colony, or you can come work for us as an employee of the FSB, excuse me, and wear the uniform and conduct operations that are sanctioned and under full control of the government. Now, what happens in a lot of those cases when they bring these criminals in is that, of course, it's once a thief, always a thief, and it's hard to change their mindset. So while they're by day conducting operations that are sanctioned by the state, by night they're using oftentimes those same resources to line their pockets with money, and sometimes they're doing both at the same time, as we saw in the indictments of the Yahoo hack that was conducted by several FSB operatives, including formerly people we had tracked as cyber criminals. They were doing traditional espionage, breaking into Yahoo to get access to mail accounts of certain politicians and other prominent figures that the Russian government would want to track. But at the same time, while they were in those accounts, they were looking for credit card numbers that they could steal and sort of benefit themselves personally. So those types of activities are very, very common. But when you're doing an operation like SolarWinds, regardless of whether it's a traditional professional cyber operative that has gone to the SVR Academy, entered the service and has been working there their entire career, or someone that they brought in from the outside that used to be cyber criminal, those are planned, controlled, and very carefully managed operations.
I know it's fascinating. And then one final question before we end. This goes to the sort of the responses. So the Mueller indictment obviously shed enormous light, particularly on the GRU, related to the influence operation in the 2016 election. Did that have any? Is that sort of the name and shame type of where we're using these extraordinary technological tools, Bell and Cat, they're doing incredible work, naming, shaming, using that transparency. Does it make a difference? Or to be honest with you, they got highlighted, but there's another cadre coming in there to continue to do their activity. Dimitri first, and then Jim.
So I've always been, for the last 10 years, an advocate of naming and shaming, but not for the reasons that it would actually change other nation state behavior. And there's little reason that it has done so. There's one exception to that, which I'll mention in a second. But for the most part, with all of our primary adversaries, it has not changed their behavior one bit. Because we have to remember that when we name and shame a GRU operative or a Ministry of State Security in China operative, they're following orders. And they don't necessarily have an option to say no. Right, that can be a career-limiting move, and in some countries, a life-limiting move to do that. So to expect them to change their behavior because we name them an indictment, that's just not going to happen. But what it does do is actually help the domestic audience realize what is taking place, and helps to mobilize public opinion, including our politicians, to actually push them to do something and confront China on economic espionage, confront Russia on election interference efforts. So I do think it serves a good purpose, but not necessarily to influence other actors. The one exception I want to mention is with contractors in China. And there we have seen some deterrent effect when we've indicted companies that have worked for the Ministry of State Security in China. Those contractors in the last few years have sort of disappeared off the field. And I think the reason for that is that a lot of those people are not wearing the uniform. They're contractors, sort of the equivalent of our Beltway bandits that are just out there to make a buck. And when they get named in an indictment, that makes their further career, they may have aspirations to start a cybersecurity company, maybe even work in the West, and those pathways will now be closed as a result of it. So I do think that specific strategy of indicting contractors, at least in China, can have a little bit of an effect. To be determined if it has an effect in other countries, though.
Jim, I'll give you the last word before we sign off.
So I gave a talk recently, virtually, at a think tank in Moscow, and I used the word indictment, and it led to some energetic reactions from my Russian colleagues, including from the GRU. And I know in China, the Chinese are still neuralgic about the indictments we've used against them. So I love indictments. They're great. They hate indictments. That's a good reason to use them. But indictments aren't going to be enough to change their behavior. So we need to think about what will change their behavior. On the specific issue of proxies, while you were talking, I was looking through the German Foreign Office's paper on the application of international law to cyber conflict. So I'll read a particular quote. Cyber operations conducted by non-state actors which act on the instructions of or under the direction or control of a state are attributable to that state. So I don't care if you're wearing a uniform or not. If you're doing it, you're guilty. And so on that note, I'll conclude by inviting those non-state actors in Russia and China who act on behalf of their state. I invite you to San Francisco or New York or Washington. We'll give you a warm welcome. So we're entering, Dimitri's right, we're entering a new world. Actually, they shouldn't. The Russians put out an annual, Dimitri, you know this, they put out an annual warning to their citizens not to go to places where they could possibly be arrested and extradited. Probably good advice. So the old lines that we had, the lines from the 20th century, the 19th century, don't hold anymore. That includes proxy forces, which, Dimitri's right, are increasingly less used. But it doesn't matter whether you're a proxy or an officer. We need to find some way to change your thinking about risk, and we need to find some way to encourage you to visit Club Fed in Manhattan.
If I can just add one more quick piece, Heather, about half a decade ago, I coined the phrase that we don't have a cyber problem, we have a Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea problem. And I still stand by that, because the vast majority of the cyber intrusions we're seeing are originating from those countries, either from the nation states of those countries or from criminals and proxies that are allowed to operate freely within those countries. And we absolutely need to hold the countries accountable for, as Jim said, for what happens inside their borders, whether it's directed by the state or whether the state just turns a blind eye to this activity.
Dimitri, thank you so much. Well, I feel like saying welcome to the new normal. I think we really learned that the precision of how we are describing what is happening, helping to educate, helping to tailor responses to that, and putting that into a normative framework is really, really essential. Well, I have a couple of thank yous. First, a great thanks to our audience. Those questions were exceptional, and I wish I could have gotten to all of them. I tried to weave them in. We have a really smart, talented audience, and we're asking great questions. Dimitri, Jim, thank you so much. You made this easy to go through a very complex topic, helping us understand exactly what we need to think about and the evolution of these tactics, which is so important. And again, a great thanks to the Russia Strategic Initiative at UCOM for giving us this opportunity to have this conversation. To our audience, thank you so much. Stay tuned for more events in our Russian Military Capabilities Working Group. Until then, be safe, be well, and have a great day. Thank you so much.